If you love running old style D&D games, chances are that you are using random encounters in your games. Random encounters add that sense of pressure, that risk to the player's actions, and verisimilitude to your game world that things are happening around the players. As they venture into a dungeon or travel into the wilderness, they have a chance of facing monsters or creatures that are wandering the nearby area. In the past, I've talked about adding some depth to your random encounters by providing some context to them. What are the monsters doing when the players encounter them? That's great detail because it helps frame the encounter for both you, the game master, as you prepare to set the scene, and it helps the players contextualize the fiction that they now find their characters in. Today, I want to talk about making one or two modifications to your random encounter tables that can add a little bit of variety and spice to your options that you have when you roll up a random encounter. Hi, welcome back aboard the Earthmote. I'm Randall. Let's go ahead and get back into it. First off, I just want to say that both of these modification ideas you can make are probably most useful for wilderness random encounters. You can use them in dungeons as well, but I think from a just practical and contextual standpoint, they make a lot more sense from a wilderness encounter rather than a dungeon one. You could certainly modify them or adjust your thinking and parameters to include them in dungeons, but it's just a little bit different and maybe not as useful in that context. And you'll see why as we get into them. The first modification you can make is to assign a probability that when you roll up a random encounter, the encounter takes place at the monster's lair. Now, this in practice means that the players stumble across the monster's lair in their travel. Now, this is interesting because it immediately sets up a possible location-based adventure for the players if they choose to engage. Again, the lair doesn't have to be huge. You could have it only be a single room or maybe 2 to 4 rooms, something like that. You can make it as big as you want, but because it's a random encounter, I wouldn't go overboard with it. Just make it kind of this small little mini adventure location. Now, if you roll up the lair chance, lairs do give the players a chance to really bypass the monster and the encounter entirely, especially if it's sleeping in its den or in its den. They can easily kind of avoid the lair, go around it, and that's okay. In a random encounter, the players have the option to bypass those as well. If it's at a far distance or if they're not sighted by the other party, they can totally choose to ignore encounters and go on their way. And that's no different than coming across a lair and just choosing to bypass it and continue along on their travel. What I like about the lair is that the lair poses a higher risk and reward scenario for the players. If you follow an OSR style game, generally lair encounters are going to have more monsters. So there's this higher risk of having to face more monsters. Plus, if they're in their lair, they probably have some sort of territorial advantages that they can maybe make use of against assailants, protect their den. So there's a bit more risk for the players to try to fight a monster in its lair. But with the higher risk also comes the higher reward. The lair is going to have a higher treasure table value, which means there's going to be more treasure there. So the players can risk the monsters to get where they store most of their treasure naturally, which would be in their dwelling space. So it makes sense if they're going to face this higher risk, there should be a higher reward, which is ultimately through the form of treasure. So the second option you can add to your random encounters is the chance of finding monster tracks. So in this case, instead of the players encountering the monster, they instead find its footprints or obvious markings that it's left behind. Now, this is obviously a lower risk scenario for the players because they're just finding traces of the monster, not the monster itself. But I think this is a cool option for a couple of reasons. First, you can showcase dangers to your players. This is a chance to show your players about the monsters that live in the nearby area or nearby hexes. Secondly, you can use the tracks to show bits of past events. Maybe you showcase something that happened in the area recently. Maybe there was a robbery and there's signs of that by like a damaged wagon or a slain merchant, something like that. Or maybe there was a fight between two different monsters and there's large tracks of that. Maybe there's knocked over trees and large splatters of blood, something like that. This is an option to kind of show something that happened in the area that provides a past event. These can provide clues to your players about the area, but also show the players that the world doesn't only revolve around them. Other things are happening in the world too. And, if they choose to engage with the encounter, they can learn more about it. If not, maybe it's just something that fades into the background, or maybe they learn a little bit more about it from an NPC via a rumor later on. Now, once your players find the monster tracks, they can choose to follow them and track the monster to its lair if they'd like. And that would be an adventure in of itself. Or they can choose to just note the information about the tracks or the event that happened and keep on moving. Again, there's nothing wrong with this. They could do this with a normal encounter or finding a monster lair like we already talked about, and have chances of bypassing those as well. So it is a lower risk scenario, but it does provide them with some interesting options that they could choose to engage with or not. And if they don't, that's totally fine. So you might be wondering, how do we actually add these in practice? Well, it's pretty simple. You just need to assign probabilities to your 3 encounter states. So you have your normal random encounter, you have the lair encounter, and then you have the tracks encounter. For me, I like to use 100% and then allocate those percentage points how I feel, and then roll a D100. Personally, I still like to have the normal encounter be pretty high, say 60% or 70% of the time. Then maybe I evenly split the other 2 into buckets, or you can allocate them however you'd like. So my probability would probably look something like this on the screen. Maybe normal encounter would be 1 to 60, lair encounter would be 61 to 80, and then the tracks encounter would be 81 to 100. So then in practice, I first check for my random encounter, say it's a 1 in 6 chance. If I roll and I find that there is a random encounter, I then make the second roll to check what type of encounter is it. Is it a normal encounter, lair, or tracks encounter? Then you got to make any other rolls to finalize the details of your encounter. Things like reaction rolls, context rolls, the size of the monster group, and so on. And once you've done that, that's it. That's all there really is to it. In practice, I do think that adding in these 2 options does have a couple drawbacks just to be aware of. First, it is an extra dice roll to make to check what type of encounter it is. Some game masters don't like that and they think it slows down the game way too much. Fair enough if you think that way, you don't have to use it, but I do think it adds some nice variety to just the straight up face-to-face random encounter. Secondly, generally a tracks encounter is a non-issue for the party. If you have a high tracks encounter percentage chance, then you are significantly decreasing the risk that random encounters impose on your players. So be careful when you're using that method. I will point out, however, if you use reaction rolls, not every face-to-face encounter is going to be problematic for your players either. So it's not like random encounters spell instant problems for your players before, and now that you're using a possible tracks encounter, it doesn't. But it does reduce the number of problems that your players are going to face. So it is sort of de-risking the random encounter somewhat. So just be aware of that when you're deciding if you want to use the system or not. So as I mentioned earlier, including tracks and lairs are probably easiest to implement in a wilderness encounter scenario. Doesn't mean you can't use them in dungeons. Maybe you determine that the next room the players come across, there's a monster lairing in it. And in terms of tracks, you could get creative. So that's something to just keep in mind as well, that it's probably easier to implement in a wilderness scenario, but you could do it in a dungeon as well if you'd like. So that's it. Let me know if you're using any additional modes in your random encounters, or if you prefer to stick with direct face-to-face random encounters. I think they're fun to try out. I do actually switch between the 2, so just using purely face-to-face random encounters and then implementing these other options. And I think that's fine. It's okay to experiment as a dungeon master and change up your processes on how you're managing the game. Of course, you should make sure you're applying your rules consistently, but the procedures you're using can be much more easily modified to try out different things and see what you like. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help out a lot. Check out Enchanted Nimbus, my monthly newsletter. Thanks for hopping on board the Earthmote. I'll see you in the next one.